There was a candy bar in the early 1990s that tasted like nothing before it, and nothing since. A square of whole grain cookie on the bottom, thick, creamy peanut butter on top, all wrapped in smooth milk chocolate with tiny cookie pieces pressed into the surface. One bite and the chocolate cracked, the peanut butter spread across your tongue, and the cookie gave way underneath. 3 layers, one perfect thing. At its peak, that bar was everywhere. Gas stations, vending machines, the checkout line at Kroger, at Safeway, at Winn-Dixie. Kids bought it after school. Parents threw it in the grocery cart without thinking twice. It made $50 million in sales. Real money by any measure. It had national television commercials. It sponsored the United States bobsled team at the 1992 Winter Olympics. It was, by every number that mattered, a success. Then it was gone. No announcement, no farewell, just an empty space on the shelf where it used to be. How does a candy bar that $50 million of Americans loved simply disappear? Not because it failed, but because the family that owned the company didn't like peanut butter? This is that story. To understand how PB Max came to exist, you have to understand what Mars was in the late 1980s and what it was not. Mars Incorporated was one of the most powerful candy companies on Earth. Snickers, Milky Way, Twix, M&Ms. The company had built its empire on chocolate bars that were rich, caramel-heavy, and built for scale. By the mid-1980s, Mars products were in vending machines in every school hallway, every office break room, every highway rest stop from Maine to California. The family that owned the company, the Mars family, privately held, famously secretive, had spent decades turning chocolate into an American institution. But there was one corner of the candy aisle they had never touched, on one flavor combination that had proven year after year to be the most beloved in American confectionery. Peanut butter and chocolate. That territory belonged to Hershey. Specifically, it belonged to Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, a product so deeply embedded in American snack culture that it had become less of a candy bar and more of a reflex. You didn't decide to buy a Reese's. You just reached for it. By the late 1980s, Reese's was outselling nearly every other candy product on the market. Mars watched that happen from across the aisle and had no answer. The man who decided to change that was Alfred Poe. Poe was a marketing director inside Mars's candy division, one of the executives responsible for figuring out where the brand could grow. He looked at the peanut butter chocolate category, saw what Reese's was doing, and understood that Mars was leaving an enormous amount of money on the table. The question was not whether to enter that space. The question was how to do it differently enough to matter. The answer Poe and his team arrived at was structural. Reese's peanut butter cups were soft, round, and cupped, a format built around the peanut butter filling. What if the new Mars product led with texture instead? What if instead of a cup, it was a bar, a square, with a foundation that gave it crunch and substance that Reese's didn't have? The concept they developed was layered, a base of whole grain cookie, square-shaped, dense enough to hold its form, but light enough to snap cleanly when bitten. On top of that, a thick layer of sweetened creamy peanut butter mixed with hydrogenated vegetable oil to keep it smooth and stable at room temperature. Then the whole thing enrobed in milk chocolate with small round cookie pieces pressed into the surface before the chocolate set. The result was a bar that delivered 3 separate textures in a single bite: the crack of chocolate, the give of peanut butter, the crunch of grain. It was different from anything Mars had made before. It was different from anything on the candy aisle. Before committing to a national launch, Mars did what consumer packaged goods companies do with uncertain products. They tested it. Starting in 1987, the company ran limited market trials in 2 cities that food and beverage companies had long used as reliable gauges of middle American taste: Peoria, Illinois, and Green Bay, Wisconsin. Neither city was glamorous. Both were exactly the point. If a product worked in Peoria and Green Bay, it worked in America. PB Max worked. The test results came back positive enough that Mars approved the bar for full national production. 2 years later, in 1989, PB Max was on shelves across the United States. The bar was sold individually at checkout counters and in vending machines, and also packaged in boxes of 6. A format aimed at families buying for the week, not just the moment. Alfred Poe had fought to get peanut butter into a Mars product. He had the data to back him up. He had the test markets. He had the concept. What he did not have, what no one in his position could fully account for, was the family sitting at the top of the company. And that family had a complicated relationship with the very ingredient that made PB Max what it was. But in 1989, none of that was visible yet. The bar was on the shelf. The commercials were in production. America was about to meet PB Max for the first time. The candy aisle in an American supermarket in 1990 was a different place than it is today. It was louder somehow. More color, more competition, more of everything fighting for your attention at once. Snickers in its brown and blue, Twix in its gold, Butterfinger in orange, Kit Kat in red. Every bar had a personality, a visual signature, something that told your hand where to reach before your brain had finished deciding. PB Max found its place in that aisle quickly. The bar had a bold wrapper, the name large and direct, no ambiguity about what was inside. It sat at eye level or near it, and it had the advantage that every successful candy bar eventually earns. It became the thing people reached for without thinking, not a deliberate choice, a habit, the kind of purchase that happens between the cereal aisle and the checkout line, between one thought and the next. What made PB Max different from everything around it was the texture, and people who ate it in those years have never forgotten that. The chocolate on the outside was standard milk chocolate, sweet, smooth, the kind of thing that melted fast in a warm hand. But underneath it was something that no other bar on that shelf was doing. The peanut butter was thick, not the thin smear you got in certain other products, a real layer. Dense and creamy, sweetened just enough without tipping into cloying, and below that, the whole grain cookie gave the bar a foundation that made it feel substantial in a way that a soft candy bar never could. You could hold it. It had weight, it had structure. A significant portion of the people who loved PB Max, most had a ritual that was entirely their own, one that no commercial ever suggested and no company ever promoted. They put the bar in the refrigerator first, 10 minutes, maybe 15, long enough for the chocolate to firm up, for the peanut butter to thicken, for the cookie to take on a cold, almost brittle quality. Then they ate it. The chocolate snapped instead of giving. The peanut butter spread slower, stayed longer. The whole experience became something different, more deliberate, more satisfying, more theirs. Decades later, people describing PB Max on Reddit threads and YouTube comment sections still mention the refrigerator, still say that was the way to do it, still say nothing since has been worth that ritual. The television commercials that launched PB Max nationwide in 1990 and 1991 took a different approach from the rest of the Mars lineup. Where Snickers leaned on appetite and energy, you're not you when you're hungry. PB Max leaned on humor and specificity. The ads built their whole premise around the name, a narrator's voice, confident and a little wry, explaining that the PB in PB Max did not stand for piggy bank, did not stand for polka band, not portly ballerina, not platinum blonde, not penguin black belt, pig basketball, plowboy, pure bliss, parachuting buffalo, or pink baboon. The list kept going, each entry more absurd than the last, until the answer arrived with the kind of simplicity that made the joke land cleanly. Peanut butter. That was it. That was always what it was. It was the kind of advertising that people remembered. Not because it was emotional or cinematic, but because it was specific and strange, and a little bit silly in exactly the right way. You could recite the list of wrong answers years later. Some people still can. Then came 1992, and PB Max did something that most candy bars never get to do. It went to the Olympics. The 1992 Winter Games were held in Albertville, France, the last Winter Olympics before the International Olympic Committee split the summer and winter schedules apart. The United States bobsled team arrived in Albertville with PB Max as its official sponsor. The image of American athletes, American flags, and a peanut butter candy bar on the international stage was exactly the kind of cultural moment that brands spend years trying to manufacture and almost never achieve organically. PB Max was on television during Olympic coverage. It was associated with speed and competition and national pride. For a candy bar that had existed for less than 3 years, that was an extraordinary reach. Back home, the bar continued to sell. Families bought the 6-bar boxes at Kroger and Safeway. Kids found it in vending machines at school. People grabbed a single bar at the gas station on the way home from work. The $50 million in sales that Alfred Poe would later cite was not hypothetical. It was the real, accumulated weight of millions of individual purchases made by people who had decided, in their own quiet way, that this was the bar they wanted. For a few years in the early 1990s, PB Max was simply part of the landscape. It was there when you looked for it. It was easy to find. It tasted the same every time. That consistency, that reliable presence, is what turns a product into something people trust. And trust in the candy aisle is everything. No one buying a PB Max in 1991 or 1992 had any reason to think it would not be there next month or next year. The shelf was full. The wrapper was familiar. The taste was exactly what they expected. They had no way of knowing that the decision to end all of it had already been made. Not in a market research meeting, not in a sales review, not in response to any number that suggested the bar was failing. The decision came from somewhere else entirely, and it had nothing to do with what was on the shelf. The path from a test market in Peoria to a vending machine in every school hallway in America is not a straight line. It is a negotiation, a long, expensive, relationship-driven process of convincing buyers, brokers, distributors, and chain managers that a new product deserves the space it is asking for. Shelf space in an American supermarket in 1990 was not given. It was earned, and it was fought over, and it was paid for in slotting fees and promotional commitments, and the kind of handshake deals that determined which products survived and which ones never made it past the regional warehouse. PB Max made it through all of that. When Mars moved the bar from test markets into full national distribution in 1989, it had the advantage that most new candy products would never have: the Mars name. Kroger knew Mars, Safeway knew Mars, Winn-Dixie, A&P, 7-Eleven. Every major chain in the country had a relationship with Mars's sales team, had standing purchase agreements with Mars's distribution network, and understood that when Mars brought a new product to the table, it came with marketing support, promotional funding, and the kind of brand credibility that made the risk of carrying something new feel manageable. PB Max did not have to introduce itself from scratch. It walked in the door with 30 years of Snickers and Milky Way behind it. The placement strategy was deliberate. PB Max was positioned at checkout counters, the highest traffic, highest impulse real estate in any retail store, alongside the existing Mars lineup. It was also placed in the candy aisle proper, where it competed directly with Reese's and the rest of the peanut butter chocolate segment. And it went into vending machines, which in 1989 and 1990 were still a primary distribution channel for candy in schools, offices, factories, and highway rest areas. Vending placement meant a different kind of consumer: the person who was not in a grocery store, who was not doing a weekly shop, who had 75 cents in 30 seconds and wanted something that would satisfy. PB Max fit that moment exactly. The 6-bar box format added another layer to the distribution strategy. Single bars were impulse purchases, 6-bar boxes were planned ones. The kind of thing a parent put in the cart during a Wednesday evening grocery run because the kids liked them, because they were useful for lunch boxes, because they were there and familiar and easy. The box format anchored PB Max in the household in a way that a single bar never could. It turned a candy purchase into a pantry staple. Production scaled accordingly. Mars's manufacturing operation was built for volume. The company had spent decades optimizing its factory lines for the kind of output that a national candy brand required. PB Max added demand to that system, and the system absorbed it. Workers on the production line were running the bar through enrobing machines, through cooling tunnels, through wrapping and boxing equipment, meeting order volumes that grew through 1990 and into 1991 as the national rollout reached full saturation. From the outside, it looked like everything a product launch was supposed to look like. Distribution was broad. Placement was strong. The advertising was running. The sales numbers were moving in the right direction. But inside Mars, something about PB Max had always been uncomfortable. Not the sales figures, not the consumer response. Something more fundamental, a cultural friction that had existed since Alfred Poe first proposed the product, that had been suppressed long enough to get the bar to market, and that was still present in the background of every internal conversation about what PB Max was and where it fit in the Mars portfolio. The Mars family had built their company on specific products, specific flavors, specific combinations that reflected their own tastes and their own instincts about what chocolate could be. Caramel, nougat, almonds, hazelnuts. These were the building blocks of the Mars universe, the ingredients that appeared in Snickers, in Milky Way, in the original Mars bar. Peanut butter was not part of that universe. It had never been part of that universe. And the reason, as Alfred Poe would later describe it with remarkable directness, was not complicated. The family did not like peanut butter, not as a mild preference, not as a minor bias, as a genuine, deeply held aversion, one rooted, according to the account Poe gave years later, in the fact that John Mars, Forrest Mars Jr., and their sister Jackie had grown up in England, where peanut butter was not a pantry staple or a childhood comfort food. It was something Americans ate, something that struck the British palate as strange and overpowering. The Mars children had not grown up on peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. They had not developed the muscle memory that made peanut butter feel like home to most Americans. To them, it was foreign in a way that went beyond taste. It was cultural. PB Max was sitting on shelves across America, moving product, generating revenue, building a consumer base, and the people who owned the company that made it had never wanted it to exist. That tension had no immediate consequence in 1990 or 1991. The bar was selling. The machine was running. Alfred Poe had his numbers, and the numbers were good. But in a privately held company with no outside shareholders to answer to, no board demanding that profitable products be protected, no public market to punish irrational decisions, the numbers were not the final word. The final word belonged to the family, and the family was not finished with PB Max yet. By 1992, PB Max had done something that most candy bars spend their entire existence trying to do and never quite achieve. It had become assumed, not celebrated, not sought out, assumed. It was simply there, the way certain things in American life become part of the background without anyone deciding they should be. The way a particular song plays in a particular store for years, and you stop hearing it as a song and start hearing it as the sound of that place. PB Max had become the sound of the candy aisle. The $50 million in sales that Alfred Poe would later cite was not a one-year figure. It was the accumulated result of a product that had embedded itself into the purchasing habits of a specific and loyal segment of American consumers, people who did not think of themselves as particularly devoted to a candy bar, who would not have described themselves as fans, but who reached for PB Max consistently, automatically, in the same way they reach for their preferred brand of coffee or their usual cereal. Not passion, habit. And habit in the consumer packaged goods business is worth more than passion, because habit does not require a reason. It just continues. The demographics of that habit were specific. The core PB Max consumer was not a small child. Small children ate Reese's, ate M&Ms, ate the things with mascots and cartoon tie-ins and bright primary colors. PB Max attracted an older buyer. Teenagers, young adults, parents in their 30s who had discovered the bar in the early days of the rollout and folded it into their routine. These were people who appreciated the texture, who liked that the bar felt substantial, who had possibly already developed the refrigerator ritual and were not interested in being talked out of it. They were not impulsive buyers. They were returning buyers. And returning buyers are what keep a product on the shelf when the novelty has worn off and the launch marketing has gone quiet. The Olympic sponsorship of 1992 had extended the bar's cultural reach in ways that ordinary advertising could not. The 1992 Winter Games in Albertville were broadcast across American television for 2 weeks in February. And during that time, PB Max appeared in association with something larger than itself, with national competition, with American athletes on an international stage, with the specific pride that comes from watching your country represented in a setting that the whole world is watching. It was a smart placement. Candy bars do not usually get to borrow that kind of gravity. PB Max borrowed it, and the association stuck. The vending machine presence reinforced a different kind of cultural moment. The school hallway, the factory break room, the gas station on the interstate. These were not glamorous locations. They were the locations where Americans actually lived their daily lives, and PB Max was in all of them. A kid with 3 quarters at the end of a school day, a factory worker on a 15-minute break at 2 in the afternoon, a driver who had been on the road for 4 hours and needed something that would actually hold until dinner. PB Max answered all of those moments. It was the right size, the right price, the right combination of ingredients to make a person feel like they had eaten something real rather than just consumed empty sugar. What does it feel like when something is at its peak and nobody knows it yet? It feels like Tuesday. It feels like the bar is just there, the way it always has been, the way it always will be. The wrapper is familiar, the weight is familiar. The first bite is exactly what you remembered from the last time. There is no reason to mark the moment or pay it special attention, because there is no signal that the moment is ending. The shelf is full. The product is real. Everything is fine. In the summer of 1992, everything was fine. PB Max had its Olympic moment. The 6-bar boxes were moving through checkout lanes across the country. The single bars were turning over in vending machines. Alfred Poe's gamble had paid off in every measurable way. The test markets had been right. The national rollout had worked. The consumer response had been sustained rather than a one-time spike of novelty. By any standard metric that a brand manager uses to evaluate a product's health, PB Max was healthy, but metrics are only as powerful as the people who are required to respect them. In a public company, strong sales numbers create obligations to shareholders, to the board, to analysts who track performance and ask hard questions when profitable products are discontinued without explanation. In a private company, owned entirely by a single family, with no outside investors and no public market, and no one to answer to but themselves, strong sales numbers are a suggestion, a data point, one input among many, including inputs that have nothing to do with data at all. The Mars family had watched PB Max succeed for 3 years. They had seen the numbers. They had seen the Olympic sponsorship. They had seen the vending machine placements and the 6-bar boxes and the checkout counter presence and all of it, and they had made up their minds. The bar that $50 million of Americans had decided they wanted was about to meet the one force in the American candy market that no amount of sales could overcome. A family that had simply decided they were done. The people who bought PB Max in 1992 did not know anything was wrong. That is the nature of what happens inside a privately held company when a decision is being made at the top. The surface stays calm long after the ground beneath it has shifted. The bar was still on the shelf. The wrapper looked the same. The price had not changed. From where a consumer stood in the candy aisle, nothing was different. Nothing was signaling what was already in motion. But inside Mars, the conversation about PB Max had changed. It had not changed because of sales reports. The sales were still good. It had not changed because of consumer complaints. The feedback from the market was positive, and the returning buyer numbers that any brand manager would use to justify continued investment were where they needed to be. The conversation had changed because the people at the top of the company had stopped feeling neutral about the product. And in a family-owned business, when the family stops feeling neutral, the product is already in trouble. Alfred Poe had spent years navigating that reality. He was the executive who had pushed peanut butter into Mars in the first place, who had looked at what Reese's was doing to Mars's market share in the peanut butter chocolate category and decided that the only rational response was to compete directly. He had made the argument internally. He had run the test markets. He had gotten the approval. He had launched the product and watched it succeed. But getting a product approved inside Mars when the Mars family had reservations about the core ingredient was not a permanent victory. It was a negotiation with a time limit that nobody told him about. The friction that had always existed around PB Max, the discomfort that sat beneath the surface of every internal meeting about the bar, was rooted in something that had nothing to do with business. John Mars and Forrest Mars Jr. had grown up in England. Their sister Jackie had grown up in England. The 3 siblings who controlled Mars, Incorporated, had spent their formative years in a country where peanut butter was not a food that people ate with any regularity or affection. In Britain, peanut butter had a reputation, not a good one. It was considered overpowering, aggressively American, the kind of thing that colonized everything it touched and left no room for subtlety. The Mars children had not grown up spreading it on toast. They had not developed the deep, automatic comfort that most Americans feel toward peanut butter. The association with school lunches, with after-school snacks, with the specific sweetness of a childhood kitchen. To the Mars family, peanut butter was not nostalgia. It was not comfort. It was an ingredient they did not understand and did not want in their portfolio. Poe had overcome that resistance once, in the late 1980s, when the business case was strong enough and the competitive pressure from Reese's was urgent enough that the family had allowed the experiment. But allowing an experiment is not the same as accepting an outcome. The family had permitted PB Max to exist. They had not decided to love it. And as the bar moved through its third year of national distribution, the permission that had allowed it to exist was running out. None of this was visible in the candy aisle. A store manager at a Kroger in suburban Cincinnati was still getting regular shipments of PB Max. A vending machine operator in Dallas was still restocking the bar once a week. A woman in Minneapolis was still putting the 6-bar box in her grocery cart on Thursday evenings because her kids expected it to be in the pantry by Friday. The supply chain was intact. The distribution network was functioning. The product was present. But somewhere between the factory and the boardroom, the bar had lost its protection. How many products have disappeared from American shelves not because the market rejected them, but because the people who owned them simply stopped wanting them to exist? The answer is more than most people would guess. In publicly traded companies, discontinuing a profitable product requires justification. Shareholder scrutiny, earnings call explanations, the kind of accountability that forces executives to defend decisions against data. In a privately held company, particularly one as secretive and as tightly controlled as Mars, Incorporated, that accountability does not exist in the same way. The family did not need to explain themselves to a board. They did not need to prepare a presentation showing why $50 million in annual sales was insufficient justification for continuing a product. They needed only to decide. And in 1992, heading into 1993, the decision was becoming clear. People who worked in Mars's distribution network at the time noticed that the reorder cadence for PB Max had begun to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have triggered alarm if you were watching from the outside, but in the subtle, procedural way that precedes the end of a product's life inside a large consumer goods company. Allocations adjusted. Promotional support quietly reduced. The machinery of national distribution, which had amplified PB Max's presence for 3 years, began to wind down. Not with an announcement, not with a press release, but with the kind of gradual administrative withdrawal that leaves consumers reaching for a bar that is still technically available, but is already in every meaningful sense on its way out. The shelf still looked full, but the pipeline behind it was already emptying. A loyal customer in 1993 had no way of knowing that the bar they were buying on a Tuesday afternoon, the one they had been buying for 3 years, the one they planned to buy next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, was already living on borrowed time. The refrigerator ritual was still working. The taste was still right. There was no reason to suspect that anything had changed. That is always how it ends with things people love. Not with a warning, not with a chance to say goodbye. Just an ordinary Tuesday and then the shelf is empty and no one told you it was coming. In 1999, a journalist named Joel Glenn Brenner published a book called The Emperors of Chocolate, Inside the Secret World of Hershey and Mars. It was a rare thing. A deeply reported account of 2 of the most secretive companies in American business, built on years of access and interviews with people who had spent their careers inside those organizations. Mars, in particular, was a company that almost never allowed outside scrutiny. The family ran it like a private kingdom. No public financials, no press interviews, no transparency of any kind that was not strictly necessary. Brenner's book cracked that open, if only partially, and what came out was illuminating in ways that went well beyond candy bar recipes and market share figures. One of the people Brenner spoke to was Alfred Poe. Poe had been the marketing director of Mars's candy division. The executive who had championed PB Max from concept through national launch, who had run the test markets in Peoria and Green Bay, who had made the internal argument that Mars needed to compete in the peanut butter chocolate category. By the time Brenner interviewed him, Poe had left the company, and with the distance that comes from no longer being inside the machine, he said something that explained everything. "You want to know why Mars doesn't make any products with peanut butter?" Poe told Brenner. "It's because the family doesn't eat peanut butter. They don't like it." That was the sentence. That was the entire explanation for why a candy bar generating $50 million in sales had been pulled from shelves across America. Not a failed product, not a market that had moved on, not a supply chain problem or a formula issue or a competitor that had outmaneuvered them. The family did not like peanut butter, and in a company where the family was the board, the shareholders, and the final word on every decision of consequence, that was sufficient. Poe elaborated. John Mars, Forrest Mars Jr., and their sister Jackie had been raised in England, had spent their childhoods in a country where peanut butter was not a staple, not a comfort food, not the thing you spread on toast before school or packed into a sandwich for lunch. In Britain, peanut butter occupied a different cultural position entirely. It was foreign. It was aggressively American in a way that the British palate found overwhelming. The Mars siblings had grown up without the reflex that most Americans develop in childhood. The deep automatic association between peanut butter and safety and home. To them, it was an ingredient that did not belong in their product line. It had never belonged. The fact that Poe had convinced them to try it once did not mean they had changed their minds. It meant they had tolerated an experiment, and the experiment was over. What makes this decision remarkable, what makes it still land like a blow, decades later, when people encounter the story for the first time, is the scale of what was overridden. $50 million is not a rounding error. It is not a marginal product scraping by on the edge of the portfolio. In the candy bar market of the early 1990s, $50 million represented a meaningful, established consumer base. People who had found PB Max, had chosen it repeatedly, and had given Mars no signal whatsoever that they were ready to stop. The discontinuation was not a response to the market. The market was speaking clearly, and it was being ignored. Who exactly was supposed to protect the product that those consumers had built their habit around? Who inside a company with no outside accountability was responsible for saying that the preferences of the family were not a sufficient reason to destroy something that worked? The answer, in Mars's case, was no one, because there was no one in that position. The company's structure did not allow for it. Mars was privately held to a degree that was almost without parallel among companies of its size. No public shareholders, no independent board, no external pressure of any kind that required the family to justify their decisions in terms that went beyond their own preferences. Alfred Poe could present his numbers. He could make his case. He had made his case successfully once before. But a second argument, made against a family that had now watched PB Max succeed and still did not want it in their portfolio, was not going to land the same way. The decision was made. PB Max would be discontinued. No transition plan was developed for the consumer base. No announcement was prepared. No public statement was issued explaining that the bar was being pulled. No timeline was given to retailers. No opportunity was created for the people who had been buying PB Max for 3 years to understand what was happening or to make one final purchase with the knowledge that it would be their last. Mars simply stopped making the bar. The production lines went quiet. The orders to distributors stopped going out. The pipeline that had been feeding PB Max into grocery stores and vending machines and checkout counters across America was shut off. Sometime between 1992 and 1994, the precise date was never publicly confirmed because Mars did not make public statements about it. The last case of PB Max left the last warehouse and made its way to the last retailer. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. The company moved on to other things. The people on the factory floor who had been running PB Max through the production line found their shifts redirected. Mars's manufacturing facilities were built for flexibility. The same infrastructure that made Snickers and Milky Way could be reconfigured for different products as the portfolio shifted. The workers did not lose their jobs over PB Max, but the specific rhythms of that particular production run, the enrobing machines set to the right temperature for that particular bar, the wrapping equipment calibrated for that particular size, the whole mechanical logic of making PB Max at scale, all of it was disassembled and reassigned without ceremony. And outside the factory, in grocery stores across the country, the shelf space that PB Max had occupied for 3 years was filled. Another product moved in. Another wrapper took the spot. The aisle looked exactly the same as it always had, with one difference that only the people who had been reaching for a specific bar in a specific place would ever notice. The bar was gone, and Mars had nothing to say about it. There was no announcement. That is the first thing to understand about how PB Max disappeared from American stores. There was no press release, no farewell campaign, no limited edition final run with a thank you message printed on the wrapper. Mars did not hold a press conference to explain its decision, did not issue a statement to the trade press, did not notify the grocery chains that had been carrying the bar with anything more than the administrative reality of orders that stopped coming. The discontinuation of PB Max was not a public event, it was a private one, a decision made inside a closed company that simply ceased to manifest in the world, gradually and without explanation, until the bar was no longer there. For the people who had been buying it, the experience of its disappearance was deeply ordinary. That is what makes it, in retrospect, so disorienting. There was no dramatic last moment, no final purchase made with the knowledge that it was final. Just a Tuesday afternoon in a Kroger or a Safeway or a Winn-Dixie, a hand reaching toward a familiar spot on the shelf, and nothing there. Most people assumed it was a stocking issue, a delivery delay, the kind of temporary gap that happens with any product from time to time and resolves itself within a week. They moved on with their grocery run and came back the following week and looked again. Still nothing, and the week after that. And at some point, not a dramatic point, not a moment of revelation, just a quiet accumulation of absences, they understood that PB Max was not coming back. Not because anyone had told them, because it simply was not there anymore. And the shelf had closed over the space it had occupied the way water closes over a stone. The store managers knew before the consumers did, but not by much. What they received was not an explanation. It was the absence of a reorder confirmation, a shipment that did not arrive, a follow-up call to a Mars distributor that produced a vague answer about product availability. In the world of grocery retail, products come and go constantly, and a store manager at a mid-sized supermarket in 1993 was managing hundreds of SKUs across dozens of categories. The disappearance of one candy bar, however popular it had been, did not generate an investigation. It generated a gap on the shelf, and then something else filled the gap, and the aisle moved on. What did not move on was the people who had loved the bar. The internet in the early 1990s was not yet the place where consumer grief about discontinued products could organize itself into something visible. That would come later. But when it did come, when message boards and early social platforms gave people a place to articulate the specific, slightly embarrassing emotion of missing a food product that no longer existed, PB Max was one of the first candy bars to generate that kind of sustained, vocal mourning. The threads appeared on early food forums, then on Facebook groups, then on Reddit, then on YouTube comment sections beneath videos of the original PB Max commercials that someone had digitized and uploaded years after the bar had disappeared. The comments on those videos read like testimony, not hyperbole, not nostalgia performance, but the specific language of people describing something real that they had lost and never replaced. One comment, "Best candy bar of all time." Another, "A refrigerated PB Max with a big glass of milk. Why did they ever discontinue this?" Another, "I have been looking for this bar for 20 years, and I still cannot believe it is gone." The comments were not from children. They were from adults in their 30s and 40s and 50s. People who had been teenagers or young adults when PB Max was on shelves, who had carried the memory of it through decades of other candy bars and other grocery runs, and had never found anything that did exactly what PB Max had done. The petitions came. Multiple campaigns launched at different times by different people, asking Mars to bring PB Max back. The petitions gathered signatures, hundreds, then thousands, and sent them to Mars's corporate address. Mars did not respond. The company's silence on the subject of PB Max was absolute and consistent. No acknowledgement of the campaigns. No statement about why the bar had been discontinued. No indication that the signatures had been received, read, or considered. The wall that Mars had always maintained between itself and the public held firm, even when the public was asking, with documented and growing urgency, for a specific and straightforward thing. A small company called Iconic Candy eventually reached out to the PB Max fan community directly, posting on forums and Facebook groups, asking people who remembered the bar to help them reconstruct it. How thick was the cookie? What was the exact texture of the peanut butter layer? Were the cookie pieces on top made from the same dough as the base, or were they a different formulation? What were the dimensions of the bar? Was it truly square or closer to rectangular? Did anyone have an original wrapper that could be measured? The questions were specific and serious, the work of people trying to reverse engineer a taste from the collective memory of strangers. No commercial product resulted from the effort, but the effort itself said something about what PB Max meant to the people who had eaten it, that the memory was precise enough and valuable enough to be worth reconstructing from scratch. The copycat recipes proliferated online. A food blogger named Carly spent 3 days testing formulations, working with people who had actually eaten the original bar, adjusting ratios of peanut butter to cookie base to chocolate coating until the testers, people who had lived in the PB Max era, said that it was close. The recipe spread. People made it at home in their kitchens, brought it to family gatherings, offered it to teenagers who had never tasted the original, and watched them try to understand what the fuss was about. The teenagers did not always understand, but the adults who remembered did. They would take a bite and go quiet for a moment and then say something like, "Yes, that's it. That's almost it." And the almost was the thing that could never be closed because the original was gone, and no reconstruction, however careful, could account for the specific alchemy of a product that had been made at scale by a company that no longer wanted to make it. What replaced PB Max on the shelf was nothing specific and everything generic. The candy aisle in 1994 looked the way it always had. Full, colorful, loud with competing wrappers and brand names. Reese's was still there, still dominant, still the answer Mars had refused to give. Snickers was there. Twix was there. The space that PB Max had occupied was absorbed without a trace into the ordinary commerce of the aisle. And if you had never known the bar, you would never have known anything was missing. But something was missing. A specific thing, made in a specific way, that had found a specific place in the habits of millions of American consumers and had then been taken from them. Not by the market, not by time, not by the ordinary process by which products age out and are replaced by something better. Taken by a decision, a private, unaccountable, unexplained decision made by people who had never wanted the product to exist in the first place. The shelf was full. PB Max was not on it, and no one at Mars was going to explain why. Mars moved on the way large companies always move on, without looking back. In the years following PB Max's discontinuation, the company continued building its core portfolio. Snickers extended into new formats. Twix launched variations. M&Ms multiplied into colors and sizes and limited editions that filled the space on supermarket shelves and in vending machines where PB Max had once lived. The machine kept running. It just ran without peanut butter in it, and that absence was telling. In the decade after PB Max disappeared, Mars introduced no significant peanut butter product. Not a reformulation, not a successor bar, not a quiet attempt to re-enter the category under a different name. The family's aversion had not softened with the passage of time or with the evidence of what PB Max had demonstrated about American consumer preference. Peanut M&Ms eventually arrived years later, but their path to market was reportedly no smoother than PB Max had been. Another product that had to fight internal resistance rooted in the same cultural friction that had always existed inside that company around that particular ingredient. The pattern held. Mars and peanut butter remained, in the words of one observer, conspicuously estranged, a company that dominated the American candy market while systematically avoiding the flavor combination that most Americans considered fundamental. Reese's, meanwhile, continued to grow. The Hershey product that had prompted Mars to create PB Max in the first place went on to become one of the best-selling candy brands in the United States, a position it holds to this day. The competitive threat that Alfred Poe had identified in the late 1980s, the one he had built his entire argument around when he proposed PB Max to the Mars family, turned out to be exactly as significant as he had said it was. Mars had found the answer to that threat, had proven the answer worked, and then had thrown the answer away. Hershey did not have to do anything to win that particular contest. Mars conceded it without being asked. The broader lesson that PB Max left behind, the one that still gets cited in marketing and business school discussions of brand management and corporate governance, is about the structural vulnerability of privately held companies when family preference and market performance come into conflict. In a publicly traded company, discontinuing a product with $50 million in sales and a loyal, growing consumer base would require explanation. It would generate questions from analysts. It would appear in earnings reports as a line item that needed justification. The market would demand an account. In a family-owned company with no outside shareholders and no public reporting obligations, none of that accountability exists. A decision can be made for reasons that would never survive external scrutiny, and the only people who need to be satisfied are the people making the decision. PB Max is the clearest example most people can name of a product that was killed not by the market but by ownership. And that distinction matters, not just as a business lesson, but as a human one. Because the consumers who built the habit around PB Max, who bought it week after week and trusted that it would be there, had no way of knowing that the product they had chosen existed at the sufferance of people who had never wanted it. Their loyalty was real. The product was real. The relationship between the consumer and the bar was real. What was not real was any obligation on the part of the company to honor it. What do we lose when a flavor disappears and nothing takes its place? Not because the world moved on, but because one family decided it should. The fan community around PB Max has never fully dissolved. It exists today in the places where food nostalgia lives on the internet. Reddit threads, Facebook groups, YouTube comment sections beneath digitized commercials from 1991. The people in those spaces are not performing sentiment. They are adults, most of them now in their 40s and 50s, who ate PB Max during a specific window of their lives and have never found a replacement that closes the gap. The copycat recipes circulate. The petitions get relaunched periodically, gather signatures, and disappear without response from Mars. The iconic candy project that tried to reconstruct the bar from community memory never produced a commercial product. The gap remains open. What also remains is the story itself. The specific, almost operatic irony of a candy bar that succeeded by every measure the market offered and was destroyed by the personal taste of the people who owned it. It is a story that people find genuinely difficult to believe the first time they hear it, which is part of why it keeps being told. Not because it is the worst thing that ever happened in the candy industry, but because it is so clean in its injustice, so simple, so unnecessary. A product that worked, a consumer base that wanted it, and a family that said no. Alfred Poe, the man who had fought to bring peanut butter into Mars and watched his creation succeed and then watched it be erased, gave his account to Joel Glenn Brenner and then moved on. His words in that book are the closest thing to an official explanation that PB Max ever received. A few sentences from a former executive, published years after the fact, in a book about two companies that most people had never thought to wonder about. It is not much of a memorial for $50 million worth of loyalty, but it is the truth. And in the absence of anything else, it is what the story has to stand on. There is a specific weight to a candy bar held in a child's hand. Not heavy, the opposite of heavy. Light enough that you forget you are holding it until the moment you open it, and then the smell arrives before anything else. Chocolate first, warm and sweet. The kind of smell that does not require context because the context is already inside you, already stored somewhere beneath language in the part of the brain that keeps the things you learned before you had words for them. Then the first bite, the chocolate gives, the peanut butter spreads. The cookie underneath, dense, grainy, real, holds for just a moment before it yields too. Three things becoming one thing. A texture that existed nowhere else in the candy aisle and has not existed there since. That is what PB Max was, not a concept, not a market segment, not a SKU in a portfolio spreadsheet, a specific physical experience, repeatable, reliable, recognizable, that millions of Americans encountered during a specific window of their lives and filed away in the place where the body keeps its most honest memories. The ones that do not require effort to retrieve, the ones that arrive without being summoned on an ordinary afternoon when someone nearby opens a bag of something chocolate and peanut butter and the brain says, "Yes, I know this," and then realizes a half second later that what it knows is gone. PB Max was never the most famous candy bar in America. It did not have the decades-long cultural presence of Snickers or the iconic simplicity of a Reese's cup. It existed for 5 years, generated $50 million in sales, built a loyal consumer base from scratch, and was removed from the market by people who had never wanted it to exist. Its entire lifespan fits inside a single decade, and yet it persists. In comment sections and Reddit threads and copycat recipes and petitions that never receive a response, with the stubborn, specific vitality of something that mattered to the people who had it in a way that went beyond preference or habit. It mattered because of what it represented in the ordinary architecture of American daily life. The gas station stop on a long drive, the vending machine at the end of a school hallway, the 6-bar box in the pantry on a Wednesday evening, put there by a parent who had learned what their children liked and made sure it was available. These are not grand moments. They are not the moments that get recorded or commemorated or passed down as stories. They are the texture of ordinary time, the small, reliable pleasures that make a life feel inhabited rather than merely lived. PB Max was part of that texture for a specific generation of Americans during a specific window, and when it was taken from them, the texture changed. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required grieving in any public or acknowledged way. Just a small, permanent absence in the place where something familiar used to be. No replacement filled that absence. Not because the candy industry stopped trying to make peanut butter chocolate bars. It did not stop, and it has not stopped. But because the specific combination that PB Max represented, that particular ratio of cookie to peanut butter to chocolate, that particular weight and structure and the way it responded to cold, was not an accident or a generic formulation. It was a specific thing, arrived at through specific choices made by specific people at a specific moment, and when the production line went quiet, the knowledge of how to make it at that scale and in that form went with it. What remains are approximations, tributes, close enough versions that the people who remember the original evaluate not on their own terms, but against a memory that gets a little less precise with each passing year. The factory workers who ran PB Max through the enrobing machines and the cooling tunnels and the wrapping equipment did not know when the last production run ended that they were making the last of something. They were doing their jobs the way they always did, with the precision and repetition that industrial food production requires. The same motions on the same line for the same bar they had been making for years. There was no ceremony for the end of the run, no acknowledgement that what they were finishing would not be started again. The line went quiet, and they went home. And the bar that millions of Americans had eaten without ever thinking to be grateful for it was finished. The people who bought the last cases did not know they were buying the last cases. That is the particular cruelty of an unannounced discontinuation. It denies the consumer the chance to say goodbye. No one got to make a final deliberate purchase. No one got to eat a last PB Max with the knowledge that it was the last one, to pay the kind of attention that endings deserve. The bar simply stopped being available, and the goodbye happened retroactively in the moment of absence when the hand reached for something that was no longer there. Somewhere tonight, someone is telling a teenager about PB Max, trying to explain what made it different. The layers, the texture, the refrigerator trick, the way the chocolate snapped when it was cold. The teenager is listening politely, The way teenagers listen to stories about things that existed before they were born, trying to understand why this particular thing matters so much to the person describing it. The teenager will not fully understand. Not because they lack imagination, but because some things can only be understood through the body, through the specific memory of a specific taste encountered at a specific age, in a specific place, under circumstances that cannot be recreated. The bar is gone. The moment is gone. The only thing that remains is the description, passed from the people who remember to the people who never had the chance to know. That is what a lost grocery means in the end. Not a discontinued SKU, not a failed product line, a taste that existed in the world, that people built their habits around, that children grew up on and adults carried into memory, and then one day was simply not there anymore, because someone who had the power to end it decided that they should. PB Max deserved better than the ending it received. So did the people who loved it.